What's up, guys? Enkiri here, and today I want to talk a little bit more about my all-time favorite posterior chain exercise, and that is the weighted hyperextension or back raise, whatever you want to call it. It's always the same. A super potent hip hinge movement that places the hamstrings under a massive stretch at the bottom and creates an immense glute contraction at the top. And when performing this exercise for general strength and hypertrophy purposes, I generally recommend placing the pad below the level of the pelvis in order to allow for a neutral spine into a very deep hip hinge that focuses primarily on working the glutes and the hamstrings, although the lower back is still working very hard as well, just not in a dynamic fashion. And setting the exercise up like this basically places it in the exact same category as all the other popular and potent hinge exercises that you more often see, including good mornings and all of their variations, RDLs, stiff leg deadlifts, etc., etc. The primary operative difference between the hyperextension and these other hinges that I just mentioned is really just the pad. Right? The existence of that pad, which actually fixes the pelvis in place during the exercise, and with that creates some very important and unique components, unique to the hyperextension, that I'm going to be discussing in next week's installment. We're going to talk even more about this movement because, hey man, it's an underrated exercise and it deserves the attention. Now, assuming that you load your hyperextensions to a comparable degree as all the other hinges that I just mentioned, which you should be doing if maximizing your posterior chain strength and hypertrophy is one of your goals, then this is actually going to become one of the most potent posterior chain strength and hypertrophy tools in your entire arsenal, in my opinion, of course. And that's really what I want to discuss today, though, is some of the differences in how you can load this particular exercise, right? Because it's an underrated movement to begin with. The people who actually do it, most of the time, they're just doing it very light. Most people don't actually load it up all that heavy, which is a damn shame because that's where the magic starts to happen. And then once you do start to load it up really heavy, you start to be able to discern the different manners in which you are able to load it and the different benefits that are conferred from loading it in these different ways. As personally, I've tried loading this exercise pretty much every which way that I can possibly think of over the years. The two main categories here, though, the two primary distinctions are going to be front loaded, where you're basically holding the external load, the extra load, in your arms out in front of you as you perform the movement, and then rear loaded, where the external load is resting on the back of your shoulders, just like it would be doing in a squat. In terms of front-loaded hyperextensions, you can bear hug a dumbbell, but this isn't ideal, in my opinion, as the bell is a little bit cumbersome, and sometimes it can actually obstruct the range of motion, prevent you from being able to get a full range of motion through the hamstrings into that deep hinge. As well, it also sometimes forces, you're forced to hold the dumbbell in a weird way, right? They're kind of bulky once you start getting pretty heavy, and you have to hold it sideways, at least in my experience, a little bit sideways to avoid hitting the machine. And that weird way that you're forced to hold the bell can cause the loading to become asymmetrical between the left and the right sides. Still, it is an option, though, a decent option, and I've used it many times in the past before I really started to explore other means of loading the movement. Currently, I prefer to use a bar. You can use an easy curl bar, you can use a straight bar, they both work fine. I typically use an easy curl bar myself just because space is an issue in my gym, and the shorter bar means that I don't have to place my hyperextension bench in a particular area in my garage home gym, which, you know me, I'm lazy. So impediments tend to stop me from doing things, so I try to remove as many of these small impediments or roadblocks as I can in order to force myself to not be lazy. Now, most of you have probably seen Pete Rubish performing the exercise in this fashion, in the front-loaded fashion, using a straight bar and with the arms locked, the elbows straight, which allows for maximal loading of the movement. Personally, when I do it this way in the front-loaded position, I generally try to hold the bar in a semi-contracted row position. That's about halfway up into a row, or even a little bit more if possible, just in order to allow for a greater range of motion to move into a deeper hinge at the bottom of the movement without having the bar or the plates hit the floor. So with straight arms done in the Pete Rubish fashion, you're going to be able to go the heaviest, but your range of motion is going to be somewhat limited. Now you can use smaller plates, say 25s instead of 45s on the bar, but still at the end of the day, the range of motion is going to be pretty small this way. Personally, I don't have access to enough 25-pound plates in my home gym to load it that way. Now, your best bet when performing the movement like this, in my opinion, is going to be doing every rep from a dead stop on the floor. That is deloading the weight, deloading the plates onto the floor at the bottom of every rep. And performing the exercise in this fashion, in this style, is likely going to have the greatest carryover into the above the knee segment of the deadlift. As you're moving into the lockout position, I think that the carryover to that is pretty direct, actually. With bent arms, you're going to have to go a little bit lighter than with straight arms, right? Because you're holding essentially a half row, but you do get the benefit of that increased range of motion through the posterior chain, through the hamstrings. You can move into a deeper hinge, a much deeper hinge, and as such, you get that much bigger stretch on the hamstrings at the bottom, which makes the movement a better, more generalized posterior chain variation when you perform it this way, right? You also get the benefit of being able to perform your reps from a dead stop on the floor if you want, or performing each rep continuously without ever deloading the weight onto the ground, forcing you to work your way through the turnaround portion, the turnaround phase of the lift. Another option is actually combining these two methods. So you could start off performing each rep continuously without deloading the weight onto the floor, moving through the turnaround phase. And then when the fatigue starts to become high as you move towards the end of the set, you can begin to let the weight rest on the ground, deload onto the floor for 2 or 3 seconds, maybe a little bit longer, in between reps. And that'll help you to knock out a few more reps and really crank up the intensity level of the set. And that kind of gives you a little bit of the best of both worlds there, the best of both methods to an extent. In general, however, if you're looking for maximal carryover into your deadlift, then you're probably going to want to do more of your reps from a dead stop position on the floor, as that emulates the deadlift style more similarly. Whereas if you're primarily training for general strength and hypertrophy purposes, then you're going to want to give more focus onto that negative phase of the lift where you're lowering down into that deep loaded stretch on the hamstrings, as well as the turnaround portion of the movement by not allowing the weight to deload onto the floor in between reps and forcing you to control the weight and the load throughout the entire movement, as well as all aspects and phases of the movement. Another thing to consider with these front-loaded variations, and this can either be an advantage or a disadvantage depending on how you use it, is that by having the load held out in front of you, you can actually alter the lever arm throughout the course of the rep, or at least as the rep goes on, you can alter the lever arm in order to make the mechanics either more advantageous or less advantageous moving into the lockout. For example, if you start with the bar out in front of you and you hold it out in front of you as you move into the lockout, then the lever arm is going to be slightly longer at the lockout and the rep is going to be more difficult to finish as such. Whereas if you start the rep with the bar out in front of you, and then you kind of allow it to, you let gravity do its job, basically. You don't engage the lats, and you let the bar drift inward as you near the lockout, or you even actively pull the bar inward as you near the lockout, which is kind of the natural tendency here when the weight is out in front of you. Then the lockout is going to become easier because the mechanical efficiency of the movement is going to increase this way. The lever arm acting on the hips becomes shorter as the load gets closer to the hips, right? Now you can take advantage of this aspect by using a more mechanically disadvantageous positioning at the start of the set when you're the freshest, and then working your way towards that more mechanically advantageous position as fatigue sets in and you become more and more tired over the course of the set. And next up is the rear-loaded variation of the hyperextension, where the bar is placed on the back of your shoulders, just like it would be in a squat. Now, in my opinion, the biggest disadvantage of this method is simply getting yourself into position with the bar on your back. Now, if you train with a training partner or training partners, this does become a relatively simple task, right? You can just get in position and people can put the bar on your back, hand you the bar. Once you start getting heavy, it's pretty cumbersome. I've not figured out a good way to put the weight on the floor and actually get set up and then get it on the back of my shoulders, right? So if you train like me, this can actually become pretty problematic if you train alone like me. It can be tough to get 100 or 200 pounds on the back of your shoulders and then set yourself up onto the hyperextension bench safely. So what I've started doing when I really want to focus on this movement is I set my hyperextension bench up inside my squat rack, and then I set the bar up on the pins. I get myself positioned on the hyperextension bench, and then I take the bar off of the pins when I'm already set up on the machine. So this allows me to use heavy weights on the movement very safely. Now, the obvious advantage of the front-loaded variations compared to this is that you don't have to go through any of this trouble in order to perform the exercise. The bar is just right there on the floor ready to be picked up, which can make the movement that easier to get done that way, since, again, there are less roadblocks to doing so. However, the advantage of loading the bar on the back of your shoulders is that the stimulus, the intensity of the stimulus on the hamstrings seems to be greatly amplified. This is kind of anecdotal, but for example, I performed the exercise personally. I've done 5 reps with 175 pounds with the bar on the back of my shoulders, and I performed the exercise for 5 reps with 280 pounds with the bar held out in front of me in a semi-contracted row position. I think I've also, and that was all dead stop reps. I've also done 250 for 8 reps held out in front of me continuously without deloading the weight onto the floor in between reps. And the perceived hamstring engagement between these two variations is simply not even comparable. The bar on the back of the shoulders, as opposed to being held out in front of me, it just creates a much more intense feeling stimulus in the hamstrings, in my opinion and in my experience. Performing the exercise this way also hands down allows for the greatest range of motion without having to worry about the bar or the plates or anything obstructing the range of motion or hitting the floor, becoming any kind of an issue at all. So in this case, with the bar on the back of your shoulders, you're able to hinge down as deeply as your setup allows, right? As deeply as your bench, your hyperextension bench allows you to do, or as deeply as your anatomy and mobility levels allow you to do. This means that you can potentially take the hamstrings through their absolute maximal range of motion when performing the exercise this way, which is potentially a very, very big benefit, especially for somebody like me who has moved into focusing on strength as well as the ability to move my body into somewhat extreme positions. That's kind of something that I'm working my way towards at this point, and being able to perform the exercise like this, where you are unencumbered and can move as deep as you can possibly move, can potentially become a very important benefit. And just in my experience, based on all of the different ways that you can potentially load this exercise, all the different ways that I've tried, I think that the bar on the back of the shoulders is really just the king of all hyperextension variations. The combination of the intensity of the stimulus on the posterior chain, along with the enhanced and maximal range of motion that you can move through, as well as the ability to turn it into a true hinge exercise, right? Where there's a large focus on that eccentric phase, as well as on the turnaround portion of the movement, at that maximal range of motion, right? You're focusing, you have to control and turn the exercise around at the absolute deepest hinge position possible. All of these aspects combined really just make this variation of the movement the pinnacle for general strength and hypertrophy purposes in the posterior chain, in my opinion. But as I noted, it does come along with several disadvantages as well, namely the cumbersome aspects of just setting the exercise up and getting into position. As well, and we have to note this too, there are great benefits to performing the exercise with the front-loaded styles that I've talked about as well. So in totality, I do recommend using a mix and match of both loading variations if you're able to do so. This is how I do it myself, as I believe that's going to give you the best possible long-term results that you can get from this fantastic exercise. Anyway, it's all I got for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you found it helpful. And if you'd like to support the production of more content just like this, please check out my website. It's on EnkiriFitness.com. Consider purchasing one of my training programs. Those templates have helped many people learn how to program for themselves in order to continually make kick-ass gains in the gym. Please remember to smash the like button before you go. Leave me some love in the comments and keep training hard. I will catch you guys next time.